But what is a pattern? At first, the answer to this question might come off as obvious. After all, patterns are everywhere. From nature to architecture, patterns are so pervasive that we recognize if something is slightly off. For something so ubiquitous, let's see what the Wikipedia has to say about it. A pattern is a regularity in the world, in human-made design or abstract ideas. That's a bit vague, isn't it? How do you define regularity without using the word pattern? Our brains are pattern processing machines. Patterns are so natural to us that babies learn to imitate their parents' behavior. That's how they learn how to walk, talk, and so on. My goal with this video is to appreciate the complexity of quantifying patterns and maybe sneak in a lesson about neural networks. Alright, let's start with a simple example. You would have guessed that as an A, even though you might have never seen this exact color shifting letter before. For that matter, you have never heard my voice before unless you know me in real life. And you're still able to understand what I'm saying. If that's not amazing, I don't know what is. What's even more fascinating is that patterns are personalized. How we perceive a pattern might completely differ from how someone else might understand it. Take for example the following text on the screen. It might mean nothing to you unless you know Telugu. We are capable of selectively grasping these patterns in our everyday lives. For example, when watching a video, we do not focus on the exact number of pixels or frames per second. When reading something, we do not focus on the font or the color of the text. Instead, we comprehend their meaning by associating them with patterns through our unique experiences. Here's another interesting example. From the book Moonwalking with Einstein by Joshua Foer, here's an interesting excerpt. Chess grandmasters could reconstruct a valid chessboard from memory only after a brief glance. However, if the boards had an invalid configuration, the grandmasters struggled to recreate them. This suggests that we remember things in context. In chess, the rules are clear, so there is a clear dependence on these rules to observe the emerging patterns. However, it might not always be obvious what these patterns are. Take the natural language for example. Although grammar rules exist, there are so many variations and exceptions that everything is context dependent, making it quite difficult to formulate them as a set of instructions and logical conventions. To prove how natural language can be so ambiguous, here's an interesting poem titled The Chaos. Dearest creature in creation, studying English pronunciation, I will teach you in my verse, sounds like corpse, core, horse and verse. It will keep you Susie busy, make your head with heat grow dizzy. Tear and I your dress you'll tear, so shall I, oh hear my prayer. Pray, console your loving poet, make my coat look new dear, sew it. Just compare heart, beard and herd, dice and diet, lord and word. This ambiguity is what makes identifying patterns such a fascinating and complex task. The fundamental difference that's limiting computers from being able to perform pattern processing like humans is the input representation. We process the input through our senses and represent it through words or ideas. Computers need a representation to process. This fundamental difference is why it's difficult for computers to grasp patterns. So, how can we teach computers to understand patterns? Something that is so natural to us. I'm glad you asked. Let's start with a motivating example. Take the following example sentences. A dog wears a shirt. The cat is wearing a tie. Although these sentences differ in wording and meaning, we know that the words a and the are interchangeable. Similarly, we could replace shirt with tie. Now, if you're given a sentence like the horse is wearing a, then we can probably guess what might come next based on what we have seen. This is what we want to model. Essentially, we want to capture the implicit relationship between the words in a language and try to predict the next word given a sequence of words. Let's try to model this as a math problem. Let W be the vector of words that we take as input. For example, the dog is. Let f be a function that takes in w and outputs a probability distribution over all the possible words in English. Let's call this p. Now, we can use this p to sample the next likely word. But how do we obtain this f? This is where neural networks come in handy. For all our intents, a neural network is a function approximator that guesses the function based on the data that has been seen. If you're unfamiliar with the basics of a neural network, I would highly suggest 3 Blue 1 Brown series on neural networks. Okay, let's assume that we have access to all of English literature ever written. We can now sample sentences from this corpus and create pairs of inputs that contain W and the expected output from the sentences. For instance, we might have a sentence like, "The cat is sleeping." We can now create a data point that has the input vector, "the cat is," and the expected output word, which is "sleeping." Now, because f outputs a probability distribution, we will encode this expected word into a vector where the word "sleeping" has the maximum probability of 1, which implies that we are expecting a probability of 0 for every other word. Imagine the neural network has lots of knobs that you can rotate and notice a change in the output. That is, if we rotate a knob, the probability of our expected word might go up or down depending on how we turn it. Initially, all the knobs are turned randomly. When we encounter an example, we turn each knob and observe how the output probability is changing. We want to turn all these knobs in such a way that the probability of the word we are expecting is maximum. This is essentially what a neural network does for us automatically. The goal of a neural network is to maximize the probability of the following expected word given the input words by updating the knobs to just the right amount. We don't want to turn the dials to give us a probability of 1 in every single example because we cannot say that the expected word will follow the input sequences in all cases. We tweak these knobs only by a tiny amount for each example so that we can generalize across the English language. The astute among you might be wondering how exactly do we feed in these words into the neural network? That's a brilliant question because optimization is well defined for numbers and variables, not words. This means we need a way to map these words to a number. We could give each word a unique sequential number based on the order in which they appear in the dictionary. So let's use this map and encode each word into its corresponding number and feed it into the neural network and celebrate, right? Not quite. Notice how we are not learning anything about the words themselves. Let's add something learnable. Remember that our main idea is to capture the pattern associated with the 3 words to determine what will likely follow. To get there, we need a way to group similar things together. Imagine that we could represent each word with a point on the 2D plane. Wouldn't it be great if similar words were closer together? For example, assume that the words queen, woman, man, and king are encoded as vectors. Can't we say that king is equal to queen minus woman plus man? This semantic meaning of words and thereby sentences is what we want to capture. Let's call this learnable mapping of words an embedding table that is shared across the input sequences. Notice that this embedding table is also composed of knobs that can be tweaked to influence the output probability. Here's the problem reformulated. Learn a vector representation of words in a vector space so that similar words are grouped together. Using this, estimate the next most likely word for the given input. What we hope is that this model will now understand the semantic meaning of these words. The technique to update the knobs or weights is called gradient descent, which is a fancy way of saying update the knobs so that the output is optimal. If we plot the learned representation of these words now on a 2D plane, we will notice something interesting. This interactive website visualizes learned word embeddings in a 3D space. Notice how the words related to animals have dogs, cats, and horses. When I first learned about this, my mind was blown. Teaching computers how to recognize and understand patterns has major implications. For one, this is the foundation on which models like ChatGPT are built on top of. ChatGPT generates an output probability for an input sequence and then samples a word from this distribution. It then uses this generated word along with the input to keep generating the words and sentences. Alright, I'll leave you with this. Although we don't have a concrete definition of a pattern, this video hopefully gives you a slightly less blurry intuition of our primal sense. Much of this video's content is heavily inspired from various sources. Please check out their work if you found this video interesting.